It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm also very happy to speak at a conference that is explicitly titled Feminist Approaches to Economic Policy, without being apologetic about it. So this is, I think, an achievement women's movement has achieved so far. What I will try to do today is to give some ammunition about the positive impact gender equality can have on some other aims that we have in terms of having a sustainable and equitable society without instrumentalizing it. But I think it is very important that beyond the moral reasons for which we do stand behind gender equality, there are also reasons that all politicians have to embrace. So I'll try to focus on these. And let me first start with the pessimistic note about the state of economic policy making. Sadly, still very much marked by austerity in Europe. And the track record of austerity is very clear. It has failed. Despite this track record, in Europe, fiscal conservatism still prevails. This has brought us high unemployment rates in parts of Europe, or in other parts where unemployment rates are slowly returning back to the levels before the Great Recession. The success is far from clear. We have low and precarious jobs, increasingly relying on low-skilled workers, and in most cases failing to make full use of the full capacity of our talented young people. The gaps in social standards persist within countries and across regions and across countries in Europe. The gaps in infrastructure are translating themselves into gaps in productivity. Hence, Europe is reproducing the same imbalances based on the shaky foundations of austerity-driven policy. The alternative to that is very clear. Any economic student with some common sense of understanding of how the economy is working would see the need for a massive investment drive in Europe, and this is not coming. This is not coming despite we are experiencing the lowest interest rates, longest period of lowest interest rates in Europe, but public investment is still a taboo. Fiscal compact still rules, and this is despite the recommendations coming from even very mainstream international institutions such as the IMF, or mainstream think tanks such as the OECD. The neoliberal governments are not accepting such advice. So attempts to weather the negative effects of the imbalances in Europe, attempts to weather the still persisting effects of the Great Recession are still very much relying on monetary policy. And again, European Central Bank, far from being a progressive institution, is actually calling for support from the governments that monetary policy can't do any further heavy lifting to weather the crisis. Fiscal policy and public spending is required, but again, this is finding no reception. Now, this is not a very conducive environment to further gender equality. Fiscal conservatism and its negative effects on growth and tax revenues has intensified the competition over the use of our already limited public resources. This has translated itself into massive cuts in local, municipal, as well as central public services. And women are the core users of these services. They are also the ones who are producing these services, so they are being double hit by austerity. On top of that double hit, services are eroding, they're losing their jobs, or they're having to live with public sector pay caps in some countries. Then they're also, of course, the ones to go back home and take the slack that is left unfilled, undersupplied by the public sector jobs in terms of rising domestic unpaid need for care work. The care of children, care of elderly is falling once again on the shoulders of women who are being hit by cuts in public services. Now, within all this gloomy perspective, feminist economists are trying to highlight one crucial aspect of public services, particularly public services in social care, elderly care, childcare, but also in general in health care and education. We try to emphasize the importance of social care and childcare as part of infrastructure, just to chime with the infrastructure in terms of transport, housing, and energy, which is the physical infrastructure. We are trying to coin this phrase social infrastructure. And of course, the importance of social infrastructure in terms of promoting development in a society has been underestimated by even the progressives for a long time. But it is written in our constitutions that it's a human right to have access to decent care and decent education. And of course, we have to make the case that this is the core of a long-term sustainable and productive society as well. So this will bring me and the rest of my talk to the alternative to the dead-end road of austerity that puts social infrastructure to the core of a new type of progressive politics that highlights the importance of public provision of care, childcare and elderly care, which of course is not only supplying a very basic human need and a human right on decent terms, but it is also has an enormous impact on unleashing the productive potential of women. So it is, of course, increasing the labor market opportunities of women who, in the lack of the decent provision, public provision of care, have to do that unpaid, invisibly at home. And of course, if this is provided decently, it's a major step towards increasing gender equality. In most mainstream policymaking, this is completely underestimated whenever there is some talk, some lip service to gender equality, and progressives have to really fill in this gap. Now, so that brings me to the small political window of opportunity that we have in this otherwise very gloomy days dominated by austerity in the aftermath of the Great Recession. We are facing multiple crises in our societies, and to tackle the multiple crises of inequality, of an aging society, the deficit of care, and climate change, we need policies that will hit all these targets simultaneously. And gender-aware economic policymaking sees a lot of complementarities between these different targets. Inclusive and sustainable development and gender equality are complementary to each other. Poverty alleviation, decent job creation, ecological sustainability, and gender equality are complementary to each other. I'll try to show how we see these in the rest of my talk. In the age of austerity, with all the cuts to public funding, we often think that there is a competition for resources. Indeed, if we try to hit policies for gender equality, I will argue later in the talk that it will help us to hit our targets about ecological sustainability and climate change more easily, and you will see how. To be able to grab this political window of opportunity to hit these multiple targets, to tackle the multiple crises our societies are facing, we of course need a very active policymaking stance that mobilizes all the tools of policymaking that we know, that does mobilize public investment, that mobilizes industrial policy, trying to hit all these targets simultaneously, with an aim to achieve high employment, decent jobs, with decent pay for both men and women, with equality, and also with an eye on both social and ecological sustainability. Now, very often when I start talking about these, and particularly when I start talking about need for public investment, need for public provision of social infrastructure along with physical infrastructure, politicians ask me about how to finance that. We have a restraint, they assume. Now, this is outright wrong economics, and I'll show you again in the rest of the talk why. But just to cut a long story short, public investment partially self-finances itself, particularly if you invest in the right direction. It does generate the jobs, along with that the income that raises the tax revenues, that finances part of itself. Of course, spending is not the magic bullet that will sort all the problems alone. This is why we need to mobilize all tools of public policy, including monetary policy, including taxation policy. And I'll try to give you some numbers later to give you some ammunition that these are not just empty words. It is possible, and yes, we can do that. And of course, if we really are serious about achieving all our goals without postponing gender equality to some distant future, we really have to redefine what we understand about crucial infrastructure spending. And this is particularly a policy method that we've been trying to pursue at the Women's Budget Group in Britain in our conversations with the official opposition party, the Labour Party, who is, of course, as you know now, contesting the Conservative government in the election debate. We have 3 weeks left to the result. But what we are trying to show is be bold, define spending, public spending in childcare, education, elderly care, healthcare as infrastructure spending, and redefine your fiscal credibility rule accordingly. It is very difficult. It's very difficult even with progressives. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. So let me try to just build the blocks of what I see as the crucial aspects of gender-aware, feminist economic policy for an equality-led and sustainable development program in Europe. And I use the word development because I am trying to shift the focus away from growth to human development. That doesn't mean that all the policies we're promoting will not create growth. Of course it will create growth, but the aim isn't growth as such, but the aim is development in the large sense of the word. And it is sort of strange that in one of the richest parts of the world today we have the need to talk about development because some parts of our societies, in terms of the provision of some of the basic necessities of human life, ranging from care to housing, is underdeveloped. So I think the use of the word development is here quite deliberate. I see as the core of economic policy making focus public investment and public jobs in 2 broad areas of infrastructure. And I'll start with social infrastructure because it is underestimated. Now, at Women's Budget Group, we have defined social investment, social infrastructure as infrastructure where the benefits do not just accrue to individual users, but have a public good character. Hence, the benefits of such infrastructure investment accrues to the society as a whole. These are goods and services, access to which is seen as a human right. And these are also goods and services in particular, if you leave it to the private supply, governed by profit motive of the private enterprises, they will be undersupplied. They will be undersupplied, and at the same time they will be supplied as an expensive luxury service that is only accessible by the privileged elite. For me, care is a very typical example of that. If you think of what elderly care opportunities are available in our societies, of course, if you are rich, if you have the wealth, sufficient wealth, to save for your old age, you can imagine having a very nice residential care provided to you. These are very expensive privately provided services. The resources that we have for social care that is municipally provided or publicly provided, changes depending on the European country we're talking about, is increasingly more undersupplied and is far from enough to meet the needs of our aging society. Now, this is for me a very typical case of a service that requires public, not-for-profit provision. By public, I have a broad understanding of the public. It can be state provision, it can be municipal, local provision, it can be cooperatives supported by some public infrastructure. But we need some sort of public collective ownership in the provision of such services. This applies to childcare, this applies to education at all levels, this applies to health. So all these things, education, childcare, early years education, elderly care, social care, health care, meet all these criteria that the benefits do not accrue just to the individual but to the society as well, and they would be undersupplied if you leave it to the profit motive. So in this part of the world, in Europe, one of the richest parts of the world, with a proud history of welfare state, surely we have achieved the means and the thinking to secure universal public childcare and universal social care as a coordinated policy. Surely this shouldn't be something that is just happening in some parts of Europe. Surely this is something Europe can coordinate to push the states to provide the resources for the universal provision of these. In terms of gendering economic policy making in Europe, this would be my top priority. This is too important to leave it to different welfare state regimes that are differing fundamentally across different countries in Europe. And we often talk about budget deficit in Europe. We have a much more fundamental deficit. We have a care deficit. Now, care deficit is being felt in women's decision to stop caring, to stop becoming mothers, because they feel the brunt of having the double day of caring and working if they try to care. Now, if we want to sort out this care deficit, we cannot leave it to women's unpaid, invisible work any longer. We have to take it to our public hands to provide the care services needed such that we become a caring society. Now, I'll try to be now, put on my macroeconomist hat on and be very instrumentalist in order to convince the politicians why meeting this care deficit is important from a very narrow macroeconomic productivity-focused perspective as well. If we provide those social care, child care, education, health services at a sufficient level for our societies, this will have tremendous direct as well as indirect impact on productivity. For one thing, of course, it's no-brainer. If we talk about early childhood education, it's one of the most formative years of human beings. They will create more productive human beings in the next decades. You can see the time lags here. It's very different from investing in vocational education, apprenticeships, which are very easy to instrumentalize in terms of creating the skills to create higher productivity within a couple of years. Here I'm talking about a very long-term perspective of investment. Invest in your children, invest in your nurseries, you will get more civilized, more creative, more innovative, more productive citizens. Well, in 20 years' time. This is where the need for public provision comes to play. Only the public sector, only we collectively, not a narrow-minded, short-termist, private profit motive-seeking private enterprise, but only the long-term perspective of the public sector and we as a society collectively can see the fruits of an investment in early school, preschool education, nursery, childcare, that will deliver its fruits in 20 years. Now, you could say this works fine for childcare, it works fine for education in general, it even works fine for healthcare. How does it work for elderly care? You could say, of course, we should care for elderly people, but you can't really justify it on productivity grounds. Well, yes, maybe not directly. Maybe when we are thinking of the last years of our life, we are not going to be going back to productive labor force anymore. But we are missing here some of the very indirect impact of not providing decent, public, sufficient elderly care. Because care will happen. Elderly people will not be miraculously taken care of on their own. Women, relatives, daughters, younger sisters will take care of these elderly people in the absence of sufficient, decent social care provision. These women will be taking leave from their jobs, will be shifting from full-time jobs to part-time jobs to fill this care deficit if we don't find a solution of collectively providing the care our elderly people need. So that would be the indirect impact, unleashing the productive potential of women who, in the absence of sufficient care supply, would be filling this gap by their unpaid, invisible labor. And of course, there is another indirect channel we often forget about. Societies with a decent social security provision are more innovative, more productive thereby. Why? Because if you do not worry about the care of your old mother, disabled child, or your son or daughter in the nursery, if you trust that that care is being provided by a highly skilled, highly paid, highly motivated individual, you will be more productive at work because you wouldn't be checking your phone all the time in the fear that something is terribly going wrong at home because your mother is being taken care of by a social care worker who has precious 15 minutes to visit her in the house, and if something goes wrong, nobody will be there to help her. You will have to be the one to rush out of work, to travel the distance, to look out if everything is fine. If you don't trust if the nursery is properly staffed, if there are enough nursery teachers per child in the nursery, you would be all the time alert, checking your text messages if something is wrong at home. You would be taking a career which is less ambitious than your full potential because you will often try to fill the gap between the nursery opening hours and your job's requirements about presenteeism. So social security, the proper provision of that makes people more focused, more concentrated, and also more innovative. It also makes us more innovative, I suppose, if we think that when we are old, there will be the social solidarity out there to take care of us. Now, all these, of course, would work not just by providing the services and the hours, but providing them as decent services where motivated individuals with high skills provide these services. That brings me to my second point. This isn't cheap investment. You can't get it done by paying minimum wage, below living wage standards to the nursery teachers or social care workers. This has to be seen as a decent career path where there are clear education requirements and a decent return to those schooling investments made by individuals. I often ask this question to people: why is a nursery teacher or a social care worker paid so much less than the banker? With the banker, you deposit your money. With the nursery teacher, you leave your child. With the social care worker, you leave your mother, your father, or your disabled child or relative. Who is more important to you? Which is more important to you, your money or your child, your mother? I have never met someone who says, my money is more important to me. Even in this very individualistic time where greed has taken over, when one thinks common sense tells all of us, actually, our people are more important to us. So shouldn't then these people be paid at least as well as the people who are managing our money? You could say the people who manage our money are highly educated. Well, then I would ask, why is a nursery teacher not requiring the same years of education? Obviously, then, if you ask the person to invest so much schooling, you would expect the person to also expect a decent pay. Surely, we need to see these as a proper investment, a proper career track, and a properly regulated area where people will be, both men and women, will be motivated to work. Now, I'll just coin a phrase here, remind you of a phrase that a feminist economist has already coined. To chime with the green jobs or green investment, İpek İlkaracan, a feminist economist, has coined the term purple investment, purple jobs. Purple jobs are these jobs that I've been talking about. Jobs in childcare, healthcare, education, elderly care. They're purple not because we see them as jobs to be done by women only. We would very much like these jobs to become jobs that are desirable also by ambitious men who are after ambitious career tracks. But we call them purple jobs because they will unleash this potential of the unpaid, invisible work of women. Now, I will say something else that will sound hopefully more novel to you. These purple jobs, İpek İlkaracan says, are also green. They're very complementary to green jobs because they are also about nurturing. It's a different concept of policy target. I will add to that one more thing. If you think of these jobs, childcare, education, elderly care, these are very labor-intensive jobs. You regard to deliver them properly, they have to be very labor-intensive. You need to have a lot of people doing these jobs. You need more nursery teachers per child. You need more care workers per elderly person to provide a decent provision of these services. Now, so that means we will actually be able to create a lot more jobs per growth, per €1 new GDP we create. By definition, they are also very low carbon jobs. We don't require a whole lot of machinery and equipment and energy consumption. We need a lot of human time and human contact to provide these sort of services at a decent level. So they're low carbon and labor intensive, which means you can achieve many decent jobs, provided you pay for them, obviously, per carbon emission. So they are at the same time, therefore, green. So, therefore, gender-aware policies are both socially sustainable. It tackles gender inequality, it tackles the care crisis of our societies, it tackles our social crisis, but also it tackles the ecological crisis. It is one way of meeting our targets for a low-carbon green economy. Now, I'll say a few more words about the macroeconomic impact of policies targeting gender equality. Now, I've done a lot of work for Foundation of European Progressive Studies, before that for the International Labour Organization of the United Nations, promoting alternative growth policies that go along with equality. Tackling gender inequality would be at the core of tackling inequality in general. Gender inequality is one of the core reasons of personal income inequality, which has increased in all of our societies, including in Europe. And gender inequality is an important reason why also the distribution of our national incomes between wage and profit income is so much skewed. So if we were to eliminate gender pay gaps, that would help us, they take us a long way in tackling the inequality between the top 1% and the rest of our society, but also it would help us increasing the share of labor income in national income. Gender equality will take us closer to having a higher share of wages in national income. Now, I have done a lot of work proving that increasing wage income in total income, the share of wages in total income, in Europe would lead to higher growth. So Europe as a whole is a wage-led economy, and I'm very happy to be able to tell you today that Finland is a wage-led economy, in the sense that if you increase the share of wages in national income, you will get higher growth. Or if you continue to do what you have been doing, what we have been doing in the last 3 decades, meaning squeeze the share of wages in national income, increase capital share, increase profits at the expense of labor income, then you will suffer from lower growth, you will suffer from stagnation in demand. Wage-led growth is actually synonymous to equality-led growth in general, and gender equality is a core dimension of achieving an equality-led growth in Europe. There are some very good reasons why that happens, and we are working on some very new macroeconomic forecasting to give more ammunition in that sense too. I have done the estimations for the UK only at the moment, but if you increase gender equality, household spending and consumption goes up. And women also spend differently. There is also evidence that women focus on spending that benefits child care, that benefit education of the children, that benefit nutrition of the children. There are very strong links between more income in the hands of women in the households and long-term health outcomes of children and a society in general. So this is something that contributes to social infrastructure from, if you like, the private household sphere. Also, more pragmatically, gender equality, closing gender pay gaps, creates more demand for consumption, which then goes back to the firms, private investors, private enterprises, in terms of demand for the goods and services they are providing. That stimulates private investment as well. That stimulates private investment also indirectly because it stimulates productivity. This is interesting because when we think of private investment, we often believe that it's about profitability. Yes, of course, it's about profitability, but also demand. So gender equality does create some demand for firms. That's the good news for them and private investment. But we think of profitability as something that you can achieve by squeezing wages. This is such a short-sighted way of looking at profitability because profitability is not just about wage that you pay to the employees, but also about their productivity. You could imagine increasing wages, but also stimulating productivity. That actually could potentially lead to even lower labor costs per unit of output and hence higher profitability. We have again forged the numbers. Higher gender equality triggered by higher public spending in social infrastructure does create tremendous long-term productivity gains for private businesses, and that does help to increase their profitability and hence private investment too. And of course, on top of it, you have to think of infrastructure in general as something that improves the business environment for private firms. We have been going down the low road of squeezing wages, austerity, and cutting public spending for too long. If we were to reverse that and opt for the high road of high wages, decent provision of public, social, and physical infrastructure, that actually creates potentially a much more conducive environment for private investment as well. Now, here are some numbers that I had promised originally, just to give you the confidence that these are not just some nice words. We have estimated a macroeconomic model for the 15 European Union member states, all European Union member states, which have long enough data for us to be able to do some statistical analysis. And we have simulated the results of a policy mix, which is about increasing public spending by 1% of GDP in each country simultaneously every year, increasing the share of labor income, wages, in national income by 1 percentage point every year. Mind you, this is a very small step towards reversing austerity and reversing wage stagnation in Europe. Just to give you a feel, in the past 3 decades, the share of wages have fallen by about 10 percentage points in Europe. This is just a minor step every year that we can take to reverse inequality. And along with that, we have said, well, let's rely on a third fiscal policy tool, more progressive taxation, which is again very modest. It's just about reversing the inequality in the distribution of the tax burden between labor and capital, increase the tax rate on capital income by 1% and decrease the tax on labor income by 1 percentage point. Overall, we get very strong results. The impact of wage policies is positive. They are small, but I'm confident to say that at least they're not negative. They do not prevent growth. They do not hinder growth. Quite on the contrary, if anything, they stimulate growth. The overall stimulus is, of course, a lot stronger if you mix good labor market policies with macroeconomic public spending policies. And of course, you could do that in one single country, you would still benefit, but the results are tremendously stronger if all the European Union member states implement these policies simultaneously. There are very strong cross-border spillover of fiscal policy as well as wage policies. So this invites me to, of course, advocate policy coordination at European Union level for both fiscal policy and wage policies. We've been successfully coordinating, sadly, the wrong policies in Europe. The good news is that we can coordinate. If we can coordinate the wrong wage moderation and fiscal compact policies, we can then coordinate surely the reverse of that, meaning policies to increase wage share and policies to increase public spending. With that, in just 1 year, we are getting 6.7% more gross domestic product in Europe as a whole. And we are getting, in Finland, a lot stronger results. I just had these results at the end of December, so I'm very happy to be in Helsinki today. As an outcome of such coordinated policy mix in Finland, we could get 12% higher GDP. You could ask me what's happening to private investment. Are the private investors not shying away? We have higher wages, higher taxation on capital. Well, no. Private investment as a ratio to gross domestic product in Europe on average is also increasing by 2%. Again, results in Finland are much stronger. You get 5.9% more private investment in Finland. Public spending is exactly crowding in private investment. It's not crowding out. There's no evidence of that because it creates, of course, demand, but also it creates the business environment businesses are very hungry for. We are all worried about budget balance in policymaking world, so we did crunch the numbers. Public budget balance is improving in Europe as an outcome of these policies, more so in Finland. If you want to be very cautious, at least you could say these policies are surely neutral in terms of budget balance. It's not going to create more deficit, more public debt. And I'm often asked by trade unionists, would that not create inflation, particularly in Nordic countries where social partnership is important? Well, no. A 1 percentage point increase in the wage share will lead to a one-off increase in prices in Europe about 1.5%, in Finland 1.8%. If you think that we are at the verge of almost a deflationary era, our advice to the European Central Bank is if they want to hit their inflation target of 2%, as you know, that's the inflation target of European Central Bank, they should do as we tell them. They should promote the high road policies to increase wage share. Now, how do we do that? Particularly, what are the gender-aware policies, labor market policies to increase the wage share and gender wage equality? It's about thinking of re-regulating our labor markets to achieve a dual-earner, dual-carer model, where we have work-life balance, which is an essential component of my understanding of decent jobs. We have to again revisit one of the oldest demands of the labor movement. That's about shorter working hours. And we have to think of equal incentives for both men and women regarding paternity leave, which we heard also in the opening remarks. And of course, all that becomes feasible only if you have a decent universal childcare and social care. Our trade unions have to be more aware about and more proactive about tackling gender wage equality. We need collective voice, but we also need our trade unions to be more inclusive, such that we're not just talking about equality, but also gender equality as a core part of equality. And in my experience, establishing minimum wage that is worthy of the concept of a living wage takes us closer towards gender equality as well. So it's about creating institutions. It's about state policies to set the rules in the labor market, and then we can make it. We know these policies. I'm out of time, so I'm not going to be able to say much about shortening working hours, but of course we have to think how a shorter work hour should work for both men and women, and a model of redefining and redistributing also care work, because despite my advocacy for the public provision of care, the people we are caring for will also want to be cared by us, and we will probably also want to care for our elderly and our children at least for some time of our work day. So it has to leave us enough time to be workers as well as carers, so long that there is a decent public infrastructure and a decent redistribution of that private household care time between both men and women. And that does require a rethinking of how we want to go forward with shortening working hours. Surely it's not about having one long weekend to go fishing, but it's about having shorter days every day of the week. There is some work behind it, so if you wish to check some of my numbers, please do visit our webpage at Greenwich Political Economy Research Center, and I look forward to your comments if we still have some time. Thank you.